Hello World Civilizations class, Mr. Lassiter with you today, and we're going to be talking about the late Middle Ages in Europe. Last night's video, you looked at the High Middle Ages from about the year 1000 to 1300, and today we're going to be looking at pretty much the final 200 years of this time period, 1300 to 1500. Let's look at our goals today, questions to consider. You know the drill for this as far as vocabulary. The bubonic plague or Black Death, anti-Semitism, the Great Schism, John Hus, the 100 Years' War, and Joan of Arc. Also, as we go through this, we're going to try to figure out why, in the images to the right, people are being burned at the stake regularly during these late Middle Ages. From left to right, we see European Jews in Germany, John Hus, and Joan of Arc, all being burned at the stake. This seems to be kind of an unfortunate theme of the late Middle Ages. Let's start off with, of course, death, the Black Death, or bubonic plague, which reached Europe in the year 1347. It's the most devastating natural disaster in European history if we talk about percentage of people killed. About 38 million of the 75 million people in Europe are killed by this disease. Europeans actually thought that this was somehow the wrath of God or the work of Satan as it spread across the continent. But in actuality, it was bacteria caused by rat fleas that spread along transportation and trade routes. This disease originated in Southeast Asia and then moved to China. And as the Mongols spread across Asia and into Europe, the disease also spread with them, usually along trade routes. In some cities, like in Italy, 50 to 60% of cities who would die from this disease. And in some places, entire villages just disappeared. You can see the growth of this in the GIF to the right. And yes, I think that is the correct pronunciation. So what were some of the consequences of this Black Death? Well, in Central Europe, many people actually blamed Jewish Europeans. And so this resulted in extreme anti-Semitism or hostility toward Jews. And actually many Jewish people are killed over these suspicions. Some people blame them for poisoning town wells or bringing the wrath of God upon Christians. But certainly they did not cause it, but nevertheless, this is the root of some anti-Semitism in the area. There were a lot of economic consequences, which included the decline of trade, a shortage of labor from people dying. So therefore, if you were a worker, you could charge more. And so we see labor costs rise even as food prices plummet. Serfdom declines further. Many serfs demand to be paid and then say they will pay rent rather than pay with the amount of work they do. So serfdom really declines in this area. As far as the anti-Semitism, many Jews actually leave Germany and move toward places like Poland. And the consequences were many for the Black Death, but certainly a large loss of population is going to impact society in every way. Let's move on to one of the second notable aspects of the late Middle Ages, which is the decline of church power, and this happens several ways. The first way we're going to look at is actually an argument between the Pope Boniface VIII on the left and King Philip IV of France on the right. Boniface VIII and King Philip, they argue over the idea of taxing church lands. Philip wants to raise money by taxing the church. And Pope Boniface says, basically, you can't do that. Philip and the Pope kind of argue over this, and Philip even tries to have Boniface arrested. Boniface does not get arrested, but because of the shock, he dies, of course. And after his death, Philip actually arranges for the election of the next pope to be a Frenchman, Clement V. And once Clement is elected, the pope actually moves to Avignon, France. From 1305 to 1377, the pope actually lives in Avignon rather than in Rome, which leads to a lot of hostility and a lot of people saying, you know, the Pope is living this lavish lifestyle in France and that he may not be the leader that people want him to be. Side note about Boniface, the famous poet Dante Alighieri puts Boniface in hell in his Divine Comedy, saying that he sold church offices. So he is not looked upon very highly. Of course, these popes in Avignon actually lead to an even greater crisis for the church after a guy, Gregory the Ninth, moves back to Rome. So Pope Gregory the Ninth, or the 11th, excuse me, lived in Avignon and moves back to Rome, but upon his death, there's an argument over who should become the next pope. Roman citizens, Italians, basically hold the cardinals hostage in the Vatican until they agree to elect an Italian pope. And this Italian pope is Urban VI. But after Urban VI is elected, later French cardinals elect a different pope who was French. And that pope lived in Avignon. And so we have a pope in France and a pope in Italy. And at this time, where we have two popes, it's known as the Great Schism of the Catholic Church. Both popes declared the other popes as the Antichrist. One pope is supported by France and its allies, the other by England and its allies. And you can see on this map kind of how those allegiances split. Mostly, it was kind of along the France-England divide because they were enemies. But nevertheless, this split in the church really goes on for almost 40 years. And in 1417, the matter is finally resolved with a council in Constance, Switzerland, where they agree on one successor that everyone can agree on, and the papacy returns to Rome. But nevertheless, the damage was already done as people began to realize that maybe they shouldn't be listening to this all-powerful pope quite as much. And some people wanted to reform the church because of this. So as the papacy loses authority, people like John Huss call for an end to church corruption and the unchecked power to the pope. John Huss, as you see pictured here, really develops the first form of Protestantism, but it's not going to become mainstream or as large as we'll see later in European history. He kind of starts preaching against this unchecked power of the pope. Of course, like some other people, he's accused of heresy and he's burned at the stake. Interesting connection in North Carolina, though. The Moravian Church, which founded the city of Salem, North Carolina, which you can still visit to this day, traces its history to this man and his earliest followers, the Hussites. But by the early 1400s, it is evident that the church has lost much of its political power. Christianity is still very important in everyday life. It is essential, but the Pope's authority is pretty much lost. Of course, there are political problems going on in the late Middle Ages as well. We've seen health problems, we've seen church problems. Now we're going to look at the politics. And the biggest event of this time is the 100 Years' War. It was the most violent struggle of the time period, and it's lasts actually 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. And it's a series of wars fought between England and France. And it started over claim to this region, Gascony, in France, which was claimed by England and was under the control of an English duke. But France says, no, 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 this is our land. And they start fighting. They find new ways of fighting. For example, they begin to use peasant foot soldiers and not just knights mounted on horses. We see new weapons like the longbow being used and cannons being used by the French at the end of this war. One of the main figures of this war is Joan of Arc, who becomes an inspirational figure for the French after she inspires a victory at Orleans. She basically was a very holy person. She saw visions, which may have been associated with kind of mental instability, but nevertheless at the time they were seen to be either visions from God or the devil. The French believed, of course, they were visions from God, but after she was captured by the English, they said the opposite, and she is burned at the stake. Ultimately, the French do win the war in 1453 and establish kind of what we know as the modern borders of France. And they do this much with the help of the cannon. And our last section, political recovery. As we see politics changing in this time period, dealing with these crises, monarchs face serious problems and competition. But they begin to centralize their governments, basically taking power away from the nobles and centralizing it with the king. So they begin to unify vast areas. And you'll read some more about this tomorrow, as well as some stuff on the Hundred Years' War. But King Louis XI in France appeals to the nationalism of the people following the Hundred Years' War. He also uses taxation to gain power. Henry VII, who is pictured here, emerged as the ruler of England, starting the Tudor dynasty after the War of the Roses, which was a civil war in England. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon united Spain by their marriage. Castile and Aragon were the most important cities in Spain. Had to correct that, sorry for the spelling error. They were the most important, kingdoms in Spain, and they unite by their marriage. After they unite, they make Spain a Catholic nation, and they even work to expel Jews and Muslims out of Spain. And they succeed pretty much by 1492, though some Muslims remain until 1502. In Russia, a guy named Ivan III kicks the Mongols out of the country and declares himself Tsar, uniting the area that we would consider to be the heart of modern Russia. But that Holy Roman Empire that Mr. Guilford told you about, it doesn't get it together. Review these video goals. Make sure that you can answer all three of these questions and that you can define our vocabulary. Please put it in your digital notebook. Other than that, you now know why, at least at minimum, why these people are being burned at the stake. Go back and rewatch if you need anything. Have a wonderful night.